Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. We've got a great in-person audience, and I know we also have a very strong virtual audience as well. I'm Becca Wasser. I am a senior fellow in the defense program here at the Center for New American Security, where I also lead the gaming lab. And I'm joined today by Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, who's the director of the defense program, as well as Andrew Metrick, who, in addition to being everyone's favorite red teamer, is also a fellow in the defense program. And last but not least, Bob Work, former Deputy Secretary of Defense and a senior counselor for defense at CNAS. So we are here to discuss a recently released CNAS report, which is called Swarms Over the Strait, and looks at drone warfare in a future fight to defend Taiwan. And this report was authored by Stacie, Hannah Dennis, who's a research associate on our team, as well as Molly Campbell in the back, who's program administrator for our team. And we're going to have a great conversation today about drones in a future conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And we're going to try and make this as conversational as possible to, involve everyone. We are also going to have an opportunity for questions from our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience. So for those of you who are tuning in virtually, you can ask a question by using the chat box that you see on the screen or by tweeting at us using hashtag CNAS 2024. So that's it for all of our fun front matter. Let's get into the real interesting stuff that we're here to talk about today. So I think we've all seen the tremendous role that drones have played in recent conflicts, most importantly, most recently in Ukraine. We've seen that they've had, this tremendous effect, but it's led to sort of two core questions. The first being, do drones represent a true revolution in military affairs, or are they just a technological evolution? And then the second question, looking at Ukraine, becomes, what role would drones possibly play in a potential U.S. China conflict over Taiwan? So, Stacie, you and the rest of the defense program have tackled both of these questions this year. You had a previous report looking at lessons learned for drone warfare from Ukraine. And then you've got this report, which is really looking at that second question. And you and the team have done a tremendous amount of work. I know that you looked at a bunch of historical case studies, looking at trends in drone warfare from Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, trying to identify different roles and missions, as well as how drones were used to close kill chains. I know Molly pulled together this massive data set of drone proliferation, which I know that you used to look at trends within drone proliferation and how that might affect U.S., China, and Taiwan in the future. And I do believe we're making that data set publicly available in the next month or so. And then you also ran a series of games, these concept development games that were trying to identify new and interesting and innovative operational concepts for how drones could be used in an Indo-Pacific fight. So that's a ton of work, and I know we don't have enough time to actually go through all of your findings in great detail. But let me just kind of give you a big opening chapeau. Do you expect drones to have as much impact in a potential conflict with China as we've seen drones have an impact in Ukraine? Should we expect to see drones play the same role or similar roles? And what are the big lessons learned from Ukraine that we should actually apply to an Indo-Pacific fight?
Okay, let me see if I can tackle all these. Thank you for that, Becca. So yes, I think you're going to see drones having a massive impact if there were a conflict with China over Taiwan, but I don't think it's the way that many people anticipate right now, and I'll unpack that a little bit. I think you're going to see drones playing a similar role to what we've seen in recent conflicts. They have the same sort of missions. Reconnaissance is a core one that is really important. Helping to identify and track targets, especially moving ones, is something that has been absolutely essential in Ukraine. and I think would be equally important, if not more so, in the Indo-Pacific, because that's one of the areas that the United States currently has a weakness. And then in strike roles, either firing their own munitions, dropping bombs, or as a kamikaze, where some drones are more akin to a cruise missile and they actually crash into the target in itself. So similar roles for drones, but for the United States, it's going to be different drones. Largely what you've seen in Ukraine are much smaller, different drones, either military ones that are attached and controlled by ground forces, or commercial drones. And these are incredibly short-range systems that aren't going to be as useful for the United States in a war in the Indo-Pacific. Because blinding flash of the obvious is the fact that the Indo-Pacific is an entirely different geography. It's a maritime domain, and it's a really big area. And that geography significantly advantages China in this particular scenario and disadvantages the United States. And it means that the US is going to need drones with longer ranges than most of the ones that we've seen in these recent conflicts, and more endurance to be able to conduct these sort of critical missions that I was outlining previously. And the bottom line right now is China is better positioned to take advantage of the drones that it already has in its existing inventories across the services to help it in an invasion than the United States is right now, or Taiwan. So let me say a quick word about Taiwan. Taiwan actually can make use of all sorts of drones in its defenses and should very closely emulate what we've seen Ukraine do across domains in terms of using drones to help it implement a porcupine strategy. Last point are the two things that I think are most important to take from Ukraine and recent conflicts and apply them here. And the first one is mass. You need large numbers. Mass doesn't solve everything. A lot of cheap things can't do all of the missions that you need in this conflict, but you do need a large number of systems because they are going to be lost. And the other one is just being really adaptable and having a close, tight linkage between the operators and the product developers, where systems are being modified and improved perhaps daily or weekly because of the fast pace of innovation on the battlefield.
That's great. And I think two things that I want to tease out later is talking a little bit about some of the impact that this push for mass might have on the defense industrial base, as well as the rate of battlefield adaptation. What does that mean for the DIB? But for now, I'd like to actually turn to Bob. So Bob, when you were the Deputy Secretary of Defense, you spearheaded the third offset. You were the architect of that. And I think a lot of what we're seeing today with drone warfare, it has the hallmarks of everything that the third offset was about. You were talking about AI, you were talking about robotics, autonomy, and I think we're starting to see some of that come to roost. I think we're also seeing some progress in DoD programs that have a third offset flavor. I'm thinking of the Air Force's CCA, I'm thinking of Replicator, but for the most part, we haven't seemed to be able to actually achieve what you envisioned initially with the third offset. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about why you think almost 10 years on, the DoD hasn't made as much progress, and that it hasn't actually been able to obtain the right types of drones that we would need for an Indo-Pacific conflict, and have seemingly fallen behind China in that regard.
Well, thanks a lot, Becca. You know, the third offset strategy was a competitive strategy to achieve and maintain military technical superiority. A lot of people still think that the third offset was all about finding a silver bullet or something like that. But it was actually having a competitive strategy in the business sense. We had the dominant market position in guided munitions warfare, and the Chinese were trying to gain market position. That was a bad thing. Even if they achieved parity in a fight in the Western Pacific, that would be a real big problem for the joint force. So we were animated by a lot of work done by the Defense Science Board. I think most of you know these are graybeards who have been in the department for a long time. They've been undersecretaries of defense for acquisition, technology, and logistics. They've been DDR&E, research and engineering. And they do a lot of work for the department. Generally, they work for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, or whatever the name is at the time. And they said, look, of all the different technologies, there's one technology you must dominate if you want to maintain military technical superiority, and that was autonomous systems. Now, a lot of people think that it was about AI. AI was a means to an end. You have to have high-quality AI to give you high-quality autonomous control systems, but it was all about getting autonomy into the department in a very, very broad campaign. Now, we thought of autonomy in two ways. We called it human-machine collaboration was the first one. These were generally software, things like that, that machines would help humans make better, faster, and more relevant decisions. That's what that line of effort was all about. And you can see all sorts of these systems coming up now. There's predictive indications and warning systems. There's predictive maintenance systems. There's all sorts of things that are designed to help the human make a better decision. And then there was human-machine combat teaming. It was actually called autonomy in motion. And it was the full panoply of autonomous systems in the air, on the sea, on the ground. And it really was, we want all of the services and military departments to go after these systems, test them, develop new operational concepts for them. Now, right after I left as the Deputy Secretary, I came here to CNAS as the CEO. And there was a fellow here by the name of Sean Brimley. And he and I worked for a year on a monograph that said, okay, where would this autonomy stuff go? And the title of the monograph was 20YY, War in the Robotics Age. So what the third offset envisioned was, first, you're going to start getting better in AI. AI would allow you to have better autonomous systems. Autonomy would lead to what we refer to as algorithmic warfare, in which algorithms and data and all sorts of autonomy were really what the department would go after. And after that, at some point in time, the proportion of unmanned systems to manned systems, or I guess we call them crewed systems now, crewed and uncrewed systems, the proportion of uncrewed to crewed would flip, and you would have more uncrewed systems than you would crewed systems. And we envisioned that being a new revolution in war, that it would change the way we fought. And so the third offset was, what do we have to do to make sure we get there first, and that our autonomous systems are better than any potential rival or adversary? Now, the second part of Becca's question is, why haven't we gone faster? This is one of these things where you could see it glass half full, glass half empty. There is a lot of autonomy and autonomous systems being developed in the Department of Defense right now. It's stunning when you just look at the broad range of everything that is happening. And I would say we're not as far along as I would like it to be, and I'm sure Becca and Stacie and Andrew would like it to be. And I would say that there's two reasons for that. The first reason was that the third offset strategy came about in the same year that sequestration triggered. And there just wasn't a lot of money. Readiness cratered, and the heads of the services were putting all their O&M, any extra O&M money they had, they were putting it towards readiness. We had to cut research and development during this time frame, which we didn't want to do because we're in this long-term technological competition and we're cutting R&D. So that's the first reason. We got off to a slow start. The second reason, and this isn't broadly commented on, but I believe it is true, the first set of drones or uncrewed systems are remote controlled. There is a pilot, and a pilot that does the first person view drone attacks. And the departments, the military departments were saying, look, we don't want to pursue a future where we're going to create more manpower requirements. And so they were slow until the AI caught up and the autonomous systems caught up. And now they're talking about true autonomous systems, where the autonomous systems are given a mission, and the autonomous systems can complete that mission without human interference or oversight. I guess a third issue would be the United States doesn't do something like this without really considering the principles behind it, the safety behind it, the international ramifications of it. And we spent 2 or 3 years doing all that work. We lead the world in that work, by the way, and I don't think the U.S. gets near enough credit for what it did. But we were trying to get all of the policy issues, how much oversight does a human have to have? All of those things were being debated, and that slowed things down too.
I think that's a really great reminder of some of the realities that we face, right? The fiscal realities, the manpower constraints, as well as just some of our principles and policies, which we stand behind in the way that they can actually impact how things move forward. I want to shift us a little bit to operational concepts.
Sorry to talk so much.
Bob, I'll forgive you just this once, or maybe a few times. So I want to switch to operational concepts, which is something that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts. And Metrick, I want to start with you. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience as probably the best red player I know in all war games, sort of what the red team counter-intervention strategy is, and more of the innovative operational concepts that China could do leveraging drones, which I know aren't always at the forefront of what we see in some of the games that we do.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Becca. I think that, for those who've been around the block, a few times, the red counter-intervention strategy is pretty well understood, going back to, I think, Bob, it was you who stood up on stage back in 2016 holding up Jeff Engstrom's System Destruction Warfare report. And sort of, I think after that point, everyone in the business read it at least once, if not 7,000 times. But that report does a good job of sort of laying out the raison d'etre behind red thinking and systems thinking and sort of delaminating combat systems. So I don't want to belabor that point here, but I really want to dive into the way that China might employ uncrewed systems in this space. Because I think it's different than a lot of the ways the U.S. might think about it, mainly because of the range dichotomies that Stacie alluded to in her opening remarks. So obviously, China at parades has shown off things that look a lot like Shaheds and Harpies in terms of, loitering munitions that might be used for a variety of different tasks. But one of the more interesting ones, obviously, is suppression of enemy air defenses. Because once they're able to achieve that sort of suppression of enemy air defenses, you can use more conventional air power, which the Chinese have in spades. So you can think of that way as there's a synergistic effect between certain classes of uncrewed systems operation and sort of the way you'd like to fight. They can open up the battle space and allow you to conduct those operations. And, standing on top of, Stacie's report, which is really fantastic, and thinking about the real use of artillery in Ukraine, you can think of the PLA rocket force, the PLA ground forces have a pretty considerable amount of artillery and rockets that can be employed in a potential Taiwan contingency. That is another place where one of the primary uses of these systems that we've seen is for surveillance and reconnaissance, and you can think of a lot of synergies there. And two other things I want to sort of throw out as interesting things that came directly out of the work that Stacie did and was privileged to be on some of those teams was that there's back to Bob's point of competitive strategies, there's an interesting world to be explored in terms of using uncrewed systems to combat other uncrewed systems. So drone-on-drone warfare, you start to see that in Ukraine. You see people operating these EW stacks of systems where you'll have many different classes of drones operating together to achieve a certain effect. So if if large numbers of these systems are introduced in the battle space, that will introduce a counteraction, and you can think of drones as being a core part of that, both kinetically and non-kinetically. And then lastly, I think there's a huge unexplored space for contested logistics. One of the interesting things, especially for maritime systems, and you've seen this from sort of some of the MacGyvered torpedo-esque solutions that the Ukrainians have used with great effect to basically render the Russian Black Sea Fleet non-existent. That's an interesting kinetic capability, but you could think about, all right, if I needed to clandestinely resupply a variety of forces, that might be a really interesting concept there, and how well does that scale? So there's some of the interesting places that when I, as a red teamer, look out and say, what can this be used for? What might we expect to see? And then obviously there's a very fascinating, and I think yet to be explored, action-reaction cycle here when we think about the long-term competitive balance in this, autonomously enabled future that Bob sort of laid out.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the activity that we've seen with maritime drones in the Black Sea in particular. Bob, I want to pull on that and ask you to talk a little bit about how you envision USVs, so uncrewed surface vessels, as well as UUVs, uncrewed undersea vehicles or vessels, being potentially used in a fight in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, and I really like Andrew bringing up concepts of operations, because when the military departments and the services start to develop concepts of operations, those are one of the greatest ways to pull changes in the way we operate and demands for the type of systems we need to conduct those operations. Now, this is about the Taiwan Strait. It's about 100 nautical miles wide. And one of the offsetting things, and I think Stacie brought it up, and Becca, the tyranny of distance in the Pacific it's a big problem for us. But when you're fighting in a in a constrained geographical position, things start to get even pretty fast, especially if you have a place where you could operate your uncrewed systems from, like the island of Taiwan itself, or if the Taiwanese Army and Navy and Air Force operated theirs there in conjunction with us. So you can just imagine uncrewed underwater vessels putting up a fence, which would warn you when the Joint Island Landing Campaign has kicked off. Then you can envision uncrewed surface vessels as kamikaze drones like the Ukrainians are using, all sorts of attacks going into all of the ports on the other side of the straits to attack Chinese merchant shipping, Chinese combatants while they're sitting at port. One of the people in a recent war game up in the Naval War College said you have to think of these as either fast mines or slow torpedoes. But in the end, they all end with a big boom below the waterline, which is how you kill ships, by the bushelful. Now, over the other way that the Chinese would attack in the Joint Island Landing Campaign is air assault, helicopters. This is easily within range of helicopter assaults. And you can see uncrewed aerial vehicles being less expensive surface-to-air missiles against helicopters. The helicopters are relatively slow. They're not as maneuverable as a fast jet. And they are really going to be at risk from attacks by uncrewed aerial vehicles. At some point, the Chinese will get into landing craft and amphibious assault vehicles to get their people ashore. And those are going to be really vulnerable to top attacks from kamikaze drones. So even if the Chinese were able to make it all the way across the strait, getting their people ashore is really going to be a problem with them because of, I believe, uncrewed systems. And I kind of lost my train of thought because what I wanted to say was Admiral Paparo, when he was Pac Fleet, the commanding officer of Pacific Fleet, he started coming up with a concept of operation of defending Taiwan generally with unmanned systems. He called this concept of operations Hellscape. That was announced by Admiral Aquilino at a conference. And Admiral Aquilino was right with him. And they started building out this concept, and they started doing small tests, and they started asking themselves, how would we sustain these systems in a fight? And so now you have a combatant commander who is personally invested in an operational concept that cannot succeed without autonomous, attritable systems, autonomous, uncrewed systems. And when you have that, then that's when you really start going fast, Becca. And you add that with Replicator, which the first tranche had a lot of uncrewed surface vessels. Yeah, this is, the policy aspects. Some lawyers said you can't say unmanned, you have to say uncrewed. And there were debates everywhere. Oh, why can't we call them unmanned? But now they're uncrewed. And now they're going to stay uncrewed.
Yeah, they're going to stay uncrewed. So, Bob, I think you've also raised the real importance of it's not just the capability itself, but it's the concept of operation behind it. And that's incredibly important. You started to mention a few different operational concepts of how things could be used. You definitely emphasized autonomous kamikaze drones, which, Stacie, I know your work that really came through as one of the capabilities that the U.S. should really consider developing a lot more of. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you believe are the most promising operational concepts that emerged from your games and analysis. Do they differ from what Bob said at all?
I think Bob hit the nail on the head in terms of things that Taiwan should be doing with uncrewed vehicles of all types across all domains. You can imagine more cross-domain drones that, an uncrewed maritime drone that releases a small airborne one that is all part of the same system that's helping to find and target enemy forces. And I think Taiwan having layered defenses, like people have been arguing for a long time, pairing drones with precision-guided anti-ship cruise missiles of various lengths, and then it just really would be a hellscape, like Admiral Paparo said. For the United States, it's a little bit different, and we continually in analysis and war games have shown that our submarines and bombers are two of the capabilities that are really important, and the U.S. plans on focusing on trying to sink the invasion fleet as one of the core tasks that it would have to undertake in this scenario. And a lot of concepts center around firing long-range cruise missiles that could target Chinese ships, and that's great. There is a hole in that right now that has been pointed out in terms of the fact that the United States does not have great ability to target moving vessels. If you imagine that space is heavily disrupted and potentially not available, and also not necessarily providing you with the fidelity in terms of a targeting track that you need to actually fire a missile accurately. One role that drones could play is helping to direct those long-range cruise missiles to their final target and their endpoint. And there are a couple of different ways you could go about it. RAND in 2020 had a report that Tom Hamilton and Dave Ochmanek wrote, thinking about a targeting mesh. And they envisioned reusable drones that communicated with each other and shared information and were able to provide precise targeting data to long-range cruise missiles. And that's a potentially really useful concept if the drones are cheap enough, though recovering them does pose a lot of logistical challenges. I think a potentially simpler solution, and one in which you don't need to pass information to as many points, as having fully autonomous kamikaze drones that target the ships. And, the line between this and a cruise missile is blurry, but you want these to be cheap enough that you have a lot of them, and where they don't have to reach back to get targeting coordinates. They can identify the ship, because ships have fairly distinct signatures, and make the decision on their own to go in and hit it if they find an enemy vessel.
So I want to talk about Replicator, because Bob, I promised you that I would talk about Replicator. So let me start off with the big doozy, which is, hey Bob, what do you think of Replicator? And what do you think needs to be done different?
Well, Replicator, you can draw a direct line from the third offset strategy to Replicator, and I commend Deputy Secretary Hicks for doing this. Now, one of the things that happened is we talked a lot about this in the third offset strategy. We said, look, when you are developing new capabilities, you want to reveal them for a deterrent effect. And you want to conceal them for a warfighting advantage if, God forbid, the war kicks off. And I think the department has been caught between that, because they say, we're going to do Replicator. We're going to have a whole lot of replicators. We're going to have little uncrewed systems everywhere. They're going to be autonomous. They're going to be attritable. And we're going to do it in 18 to 24 months. And everybody's going, huzzah, huzzah. But then you don't hear anything about it. And so I think the announcement of Replicator was supposed to have a deterrent effect, in my view. And I actually believe that it will. That Chinese military planners are now going to have to start thinking, hey, we thought we had solved the problem of the counter-intervention campaign. We knew what the Americans were going to do. We have the systems to confront them. We have the ISR system to make sure that we can compete. We've got this thing linked. And now there's a whole new theory of the case that they have to think about. And so, in my view, I believe it will have a deterrent effect. But nobody will tell you this is how we're going to use these systems in a fight. They will talk broadly, like I did. Hey, you can imagine these uncrewed surface vessels being used as either slow torpedoes or fast mines. You can imagine those things. But Admiral Paparo is not going to come out and say, okay, here is the way we will employ these systems. Because Admiral Paparo wants to have an advantage if the war kicks off. And he doesn't want the Chinese Navy to know exactly the way he intends to use them. So that's a long way of saying, Becca, that I applaud the vision. I applaud, things are happening. The first tranche has been awarded. I like the things that are in the first tranche, a lot of uncrewed surface vessels, which is completely consistent with supporting the combatant commander. But I don't know if we have enough money to do it. I don't know if Congress will support it, because like the Chinese, what is this? What are these things going to do? So people will look back on Replicator, I am absolutely confident, and say this was a turning point in the department's journey to an autonomous future.
Well, that's very uplifting and good to hear. But I do think that you are incredibly right that Congress is essential and is an essential partner to actually making Replicator happen. And I think that it's interesting, some of that deterrent messaging that you were talking about, they haven't announced exactly which systems, aside from Switchblade, were part of Tranche 1. I do hear that we are gearing up for Tranche 2 probably by the end of the summer, so I know that we're looking toward those announcements. So, Stacie, your report recommends, different types of drones that the U.S. may want to acquire or at least develop in some way. So, as you're looking to Tranche 2 of Replicator, what types of capabilities would you like to see?
Such a good question. I think they have to be longer range. Right now, what you're seeing with things like the Switchblade, which is a great system for ground forces, would be a great system for Taiwan to employ. The time distance problem is such a challenge for the United States that getting lots of small things there at the right moment in time when you have to travel long distances is going to be one hill too far to go, and that the U.S. has to be looking for longer range systems. So the Air Force had announced the Enterprise Test Vehicle, which is another thing with DIU, that is supposed to be 500 nautical mile range. That's closer to where it needs to be, but really not long enough. You're needing to see things that have 1,000 miles for a one-way system. And then if they're intended to be reusable, you're looking at multiple thousands of miles and a pretty considerable endurance, which is likely to be bigger and more expensive, which means you're going to have to find ways to keep the costs down, try to leverage sort of commercial components whenever you can. But I would like to see more longer range air systems. I think more UUVs, the underwater vehicles as well, because that is a smaller system that the U.S. could potentially deploy covertly with submarines. So that could be useful for them.
Metrick, thinking to Bob's point about Replicator being an effective deterrent messaging approach, what would you like to see in Tranche 2 that you think could have some type of deterrent effect on China based on some of the operational concepts and strategies that you expect them to employ?
So I think the department is going to need to think through, not just for Tranche 2, but for Tranche 1 and tranches into the future, is really think about that messaging component to it. The reveal conceal discussions are something that I've floated in and out throughout my career, and I think that we often, at least in the modern age, hedge a little bit too much conceal and maybe not enough targeted reveal, and we don't necessarily, at least from sitting out here in think tank land, have what an integrated revelation strategy, and how we think, to borrow a phrase from Russian doctrine, how we think we achieve reflexive control against the PRC with a integrated strategy of capability messaging over time in furtherance of a competitive strategy. That's kind of a big word salad way of saying, like, we should think about how we tell the Chinese what we can do in a way that we think advantages us. And that sometimes can feel a little pointy and uncomfortable because it's not necessarily, I think, what the U.S. is most comfortable doing, but is like important when you're in these sorts of long-term competitions. The other thing I just want to remark on is I think that a lot of the current discussions about autonomous systems are endemic of a larger problem in U.S. force planning, and it's that it's a binary. We think of things as it's either apples or oranges. It's either a 0 or a 1, and often the solutions that we need, Stacie was talking a lot about range, Bob was talking a lot about some of these attritable systems that can be, at the tip of the spear. There's a place for all of this, but it's how that these systems integrate in a concept of operation, not just for the early fight, but a concept of operation that moves from an early fight into a more protracted conflict and then finally ending at some theory of termination. And I think that oftentimes we run to the ball of a specific scenario or a specific problem, which is important, don't get me wrong, but we lose some of that breadth and we lose some of that perspective on how heterogeneous combat systems fit together and achieve deterrent effects, not just immediate deterrent effects, but deterrent effects that have some degree of longevity.
If I can just jump in really quickly, I totally agree with everything Andrew said there, and I would note that one of the areas you didn't see me talk about in terms of drones was, a stealthy long-range drone that can conduct penetrating strikes within the Chinese mainland. When I'm talking a couple thousand miles range, that is to have an effect over the Taiwan Strait. So one of the areas that we ended up not going, or the players ended up not going in the TTX that we ran, was thinking about deep strikes with drones, because then it has to be a stealthy system that's going to drive the cost up. And in fact, it doesn't have the sort of payload capacity that a bomber does. So it becomes a point where you're like, why don't we just buy more long-range bombers instead of drones at this point in time? So It's not to say that we don't need stealthy drones. I think that's very much what the Air Force is attempting to do with the CCA program for air-to-air combat, but those are not sort of conducting the same type of strikes and don't have the same sort of capacity that a long-range bomber does.
So I'm going to shift us to talking about counter UAS, because I think that's something that's incredibly important. We've seen the need for it in Ukraine. We've also seen the need for it based on U.S. operations in the Red Sea. I don't think we've fully wrapped our heads around the how do we build it question of CUAS, but I was wondering, Bob, if you could tell us a little bit about what sorts of counter-drone defenses you believe are most needed in a potential fight with China.
All of them.
As I said, there's a can we build it question.
Well, the first thing is to go after EW. You can see the success that the Russians are having with electronic warfare in Ukraine. In fact, those guys are serious competitors in the land of EW. The value of EW is you can wipe out swaths of uncrewed systems rather than having to target and fire at one and then shift your targeting to another. So EW is at the top of the list. The second thing would be kinetic systems. I think it was Metrick who mentioned, drone v. drone. Can we put up a 100 drone swarm and go against their 50 drone swarm? And we're working that, not we, since I'm no longer in the Department of Defense, but the Department of Defense is working that problem now. They're trying to say, how do we control the the swarms? What would be our concept of operation? How would we do this? EW would be one, and I include cyber in EW, but a lot of people would argue that we should separate them and have EW and cyber defenses separate so that neither is lost by an overemphasis on one of the two methods. So electronic warfare, cyber, and kinetic systems. Although kinetic systems, trading drone v. drone, you better be on the right side of that cost equation, or you just get yourself into a whole bunch of issues when you're building your force structure. I would say that the Army just announced their new PrSM missile. It's the Precision Strike Missile. It's the replacement for ATACMS. It's got a longer range. It can go out to 499 kilometers. So it is a post-INF system. And it just hit a moving maritime target. First time, shot from an Army multi-domain task force and hit the ship. When they announced the PrSM, they are also announcing they're going to put a whole bunch of guided submunitions in the front end. So now you'll have a system where you shoot out the PrSM to a basket over the Taiwan Strait. It will poop out 10 or 20 uncrewed kamikaze drones. Now, we used to have this thing called the LOCAS, the Low Cost Autonomous Attack System, and it would go out and it would search a target box, and if it found something that was in its target library, it would attack without asking for any more permission. Once a commander said, I want you to kill every tank in this box. There are no allies in this box. Every tank that you see is a bad guy tank. If you see a bad guy tank, kill it. Now, a lot of people say, still to now, this goes back to the policy question, that you have to have a human in the loop on those type systems. That is wrong. You do not have to have a human in the loop for those type systems. What you absolutely have to have is a human making the decision to kill a target. That is required in our policy. And it just makes sense. You don't want to say go out and kill any tank you see and find out that we're attacking M1 tanks. But you do not have to have a man in the loop on these systems. You have to have a concept of operation where a human must make the decision to take human life. As long as you have done that, then you are within our policy and within international humanitarian law.
Well, I'm going to make the human decision to switch to Q&A just to make sure that we get to everyone, because I already have a ton of questions coming in online. But again, for those of you who are tuning in virtually, just please use the chat function, or you could tweet at us at hashtag CNAS 2024. But before I shift to the ones that I have already queued up, does anyone in the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay, right in the front.
Thank you, Lauren Fish, L3 Harris. So, Mr. Work, you talked a lot about the successes of Replicator to date and that as a format. What do you see as the next steps for Tranche 2 or for future administration potentially to carry that forward, including potentially without needing there to be such high-level senior leader attention on it, making this more of an embedded part of the acquisition process? Thank you.
It's a great question. I would think that we have to prove that we can deliver in the 18 to 24 month time frame. There's a lot of people who say that is all smoke and mirrors. So we've got to demonstrate that. And then, as Andrew said, we have to be thinking about Tranche 2, Tranche 3, Tranche 4, how they all fit together. And I think, I like your point. I think Secretary Hicks has to keep talking about it, but she has to keep delegating authority to the broader enterprise, DIU, Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition, and make sure that we do get beyond just the boutique type stuff and we start making large numbers of these systems.
And I think that's part of the work that you and Andrew are doing as part of the CNAS Defense Technology Task Force, where you're trying to think about how you can actually go faster and at scale using what you have. So I'm not sure if there's anything from some of the recent task force meetings that might be applicable here.
I think we look at what, is going on within Replicator and sort of the DSC's focus on that as something that's laudable, but, very much point well taken on that needs to be institutionalized. And so, my hope is that through the Defense Innovation Steering Group and other bodies that can be more institutionalized, but this is one of the problems facing the department. I think we are very capable of going fast and actually achieving scale, but it requires senior leader focus. So that might not be a bad thing, but it just means that you need successive senior leaders and you need the right collection of them in series, which is kind of the trick. That was something that was remarked to me by a former secretary, was that you needed the right people in series in order to achieve what you ended up achieving with the second offset. So this is a thing that I think the acquisition reform community needs to look broadly at. I know PPBE Commission has done really great work in this, but this is how do marquee programs get over the finish line in a rapid way in a more institutionalized fashion? Because as Bob likes to point out, the department can go fast. The department can achieve innovative things and does so often. But Andrew Metrick's personal opinion is those only occur when there's that secret sauce mixed together. I think what we all want is that to happen a little bit more broadly.
So we have a great question from our virtual audience from Octavian, who wanted to know, what role will drones have on the way stand-in forces prepare to fight? So Stacie, I'd like to turn that one to you based on some of the work that you've been doing.
Sure. I mean, if you're talking about Marine Corps stand-in forces, uncrewed systems are one of the core capabilities that they're looking at employing, and mainly for intelligence and targeting, that they're planning to pass not just to the Marine littoral regiments that are operating in the area, but also to the Navy to engage with. So it's a more distributed kill chain, and having the stand-in forces really being the eyes on the scene that find that enemy targets.
Bob, do you have any thoughts on stand-in forces? I know you've written in the past talking about light hunter-killer teams that can call in precisely highly lethal fires. So that sounds like a concept for stand-in forces to me.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the into the brouhaha inside the Marine Corps between the retired generals, who I refer to as the battleship generals, and the current crop of leaders in the Marine Corps. So I prefer not to get into any questions about that. It will lead, it's a road to perdition. But this gets to some of the things Stacie was saying. Instead of buying long-range missiles, you can insert stand-in forces with shorter range missiles. The Marines plan on firing the PRISM. The Marines plan on firing the Naval Strike Missile. These are missiles that generally are going to have between 1 and 300 miles range. So they're not the big dogs that Stacie is talking about that maybe we could fire from Guam. A lot of people don't know, and the retired generals won't say, when General Berger came up with this idea, he was the commandant at the time, when he came up with the idea for Force Design 2030 and stand-in forces, Dave Norquist, who is the deputy secretary, said, look, this sounds good to me, but I don't have the operational experience or background to make a judgment. So he turned it over to the OSD Red Team, which is a standing team that knows everything about that we know within the intelligence record about China's thinking about the fight in the Western Pacific, how they think about prosecuting the fight, etc. And the Red Team said, this will be useful, which is why Deputy Secretary Norquist approved Force Design 2030. So the whole idea that no one knew what Force Design 2030 was about is just a crock of crap. Now I'm starting to show my side of the
And I believe crock of crap is the very technical term. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Roxana? Can you wait for the mic for a second? Sorry.
Hi, Roxana Tiran with Bloomberg. I have a specific Navy question when it comes to autonomous systems. Do you consider, and Secretary Work, you were the one who first discovered Sea Hunter and talked about its applications for the future and how you wanted to see more. Do you consider that the Navy actually is particularly focused on developing these kind of drones and have the operational strategy to implement them in their force, or do you think that they're particularly focused on the traditional navies and spending a lot of money on destroyers, submarines, etc.? We've seen a lot of experiments, right? The Navy has done a lot. They're allowing combatant commanders to come up with ideas basically from the bottom up. But it strikes me, either it is the concealment, but it strikes me that they're not really thinking operationally how to implement these things in operations. I might have the wrong opinion here, but I'm curious to find out yours.
No, it's a good question. I think the Navy has been slow off the mark, and they haven't gone nearly as fast as they should have been, in my view. They were content to let Pacific Fleet kind of think about this rather than institutional Navy. But then Task Force 59, you've probably heard about this. It's a task force out in the Gulf in which the NAVCENT, the Naval Forces Central Command, said, look, we have this big problem of ISR in this large body of water, and uncrewed systems would really help us. So they started a really fast experimental turn with DIU, and I think that caught the Navy's attention. And they said, hey, we ought to be doing more of these demonstrations. The Navy just announced the Manta Ray UUV. You've probably seen it. It looks really cool. It's got a lot of payload, and it's got a lot of endurance. It doesn't have high speed, but it is self-deployable to, it would be self-deployable from Guam to the Taiwan Strait, and would be able to plant mines, do ISR, carry coyotes or switchblades or whatever you might have. So I think the Navy is really starting to pick up its work, but I agree totally with you. They have been focused on crewed vessels, destroyers, aircraft carriers, etc. But doesn't matter how fast you go, it just matters who finishes first. And so, you know, I think the Navy really has a lot of things going on, and I'm very optimistic about where they're headed.
And that's good news. We have one last question from our online audience. And Stacie, I'm going to pose this to you, and then Metrick, if you want to chime in, please feel free. But thinking about Taiwan, what can the U.S. do to encourage Taiwan to use drones in the appropriate way and to potentially look to produce drones indigenously, as we think about some of what your report highlights about trying to get some of these capabilities to the theater?
Yeah, I think the United States, I mean, the obvious things are selling or providing Taiwan with drones, which we're already seeing happening. There was just the report recently in the news about the first tranche going to Taiwan. But that the U.S. right now can't produce enough itself. And this is actually a deficiency that both partners have in terms of the drone defense industrial base. The military and commercial side is too weak, and there need to be investments in both parties. Taiwan would be a really challenging partner to resupply during a conflict, unlike Ukraine, where you have landlines of communication that you control and that are safe because they're NATO countries. So Taiwan needs to really be prepared and have an ability to produce some of the smaller drones that it could use on island. So I think that this is one of the other areas that we didn't really hit on, that where China is so advantaged right now, where Chinese companies just dominate the commercial drone market.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about how there's a potential problem for the U.S. of overlearning from Ukraine because of the geography and the distances are different for U.S. In other theaters. I don't know if Taiwan can do the same. I think that, and I think you've seen Taiwanese senior leadership sort of make statements in that direction of acknowledging that there are approaches that they can learn from the way Ukraine has looked at their defense problem they're currently facing. But you know, I do want to also acknowledge the fact that from a Taiwanese perspective is that it's not an either or, it's a yes and, because there is a role, and this is the same thing the Navy runs into, there is a role for, let's call it traditional forces and traditional force structure in peacetime. Especially for a lot of like gray zone management activities, which when you're 100 nautical miles from a country whose express purpose is to invade and conquer you, they will try things that aren't landing tens of thousands of troops on your islands. They will try other things, and those other things might not be well blunted by the classes of unmanned systems or uncrewed systems that are best used for that higher end thing. So there's a lot of yes and across a lot of these trades, and they're not as cut and dry as they're often portrayed out here in think tank land.
Yes. Always a complex problem, and always something that we need to be thinking about, particularly as you do need these wide mix of systems, both sophisticated and perhaps some of these more simple attritable systems. There are larger implications for force structure as well as defense industrial base. But unfortunately, I think we could probably talk about this for another few hours, but I'm told that we are all out of time. So we are going to wrap things up, but thank you to everyone who joined us today, either in person or virtually. And for those of you who are in person, we have copies of the report available for you. For those of you who tuned in online, you can always go to our website to download it. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you to our panelists for an awesome conversation.